Hello everyone, it's Mr. D helping you out here with cellular respiration today. So when we're talking about cellular respiration, the first thing that we have to talk about is how cells make and use energy. And the big thing here is that all cells use the exact same energy source, the exact same molecule. It's a molecule called adenosine triphosphate. And so I do this to my kids in class, and it's not too, it is a little funny. But I like when people can say the words properly. So repeat after me. Adenosine triphosphate. You didn't actually say it, did you? Try again. Adenosine triphosphate. There we go. That sounded right. So adenosine triphosphate, or what we abbreviate down to ATP, is usable cell energy. The really important thing about it is that it's got a very basic structure here. It's got one part that we're just going to simplify super easily and call adenosine. But then it's got 3 phosphates on it. And for my class, you don't need to worry about the details there, the structure or anything. You should know that there's an adenosine and 3 phosphates. But that is the molecule that all living things use for energy. And so the big thing is, when you have ATP, how you get the energy out of it is you have to break off the 3rd phosphate. So triphosphate means there's 3 phosphates there. When you're using energy, what you're doing is you're actually breaking off the 3rd phosphate on ATP. Breaking off that 3rd phosphate doesn't actually right away release energy. Later, the phosphate will bond with another molecule, and when you form a chemical bond, that's a high energy bond, so that's going to release energy. And that energy that's released, you can use to do whatever you're doing. So right now, you may be staring at the screen, breathing, clicking on stuff, using the mouse. All of that requires energy, and all of that, you're getting that energy from ATP and from that 3rd phosphate breaking off. Well, what you end up with when that 3rd phosphate breaks off with is a molecule called ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So guess how many phosphates are on ADP? That's right, di means 2, so there's 2 phosphates on ADP. That ADP is then recycled, and it's used by adding a phosphate on to remake ATP, and the whole process goes over again. When you need to use ATP, that 3rd phosphate breaks off, bonds with another molecule, releases energy, bam, you use that energy, you get ADP, which then recharges with the 3rd phosphate to remake ATP, etc., etc. And so the big question becomes, how do we do this step right here? How do we go back from ADP to ATP? How do we get that 3rd phosphate on? And the answer is through a process called cellular respiration. And cellular respiration allows ATP to actually be made. And since we know that ATP is a molecule that all cells use, it's something that all cells must be able to do. They must go through this process of cellular respiration. So basically, what the purpose of cellular respiration is. So I'm really big on hitting this purpose. The whole purpose behind why cells go through cellular respiration is that they take stored chemical energy and they turn that stored chemical energy into usable cell energy. Energy that our cells can actually make use of. And we know that usable cell energy, we just got done saying, was the molecule ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So your whole goal is going to be take stored energy, make it ATP. Well, there's 2 different ways that cells can go about making this usable cell energy, or ATP. They can do it aerobically or anaerobically. You may have heard these terms before with exercise, aerobic exercise. You may think of someone like doing water aerobics, like your mom in the water, being like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. But the big thing with aerobic exercise is you're getting oxygen. So aerobic respiration means with oxygen. Anaerobic, whenever you put that prefix "an" in front of something, it means without. So literally, if aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobic is going to mean without oxygen. So aerobic cellular respiration is going to use oxygen, anaerobic is not going to use oxygen. Some organisms have access to oxygen and use it. Some don't. Sometimes we as humans have access to oxygen, but sometimes when we're doing certain exercises or we're in certain situations, we don't have enough oxygen available in our cells, so we need an alternative way to make energy, so we go through anaerobic. And the last little thing that you need to know before we get started is what is that stored chemical energy that we're going to be able to turn into ATP? And that stored chemical energy is a molecule called glucose. If you look right here, this is glucose. Its chemical formula, C6H12O6. So that's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens all bonded together. Well, the thing about glucose, the reason why it has so much stored energy, is that it has a ton of bonds. All those blue lines are chemical bonds. Chemical bonds are where the energy is stored at in a molecule. So glucose, ton of stored energy. Glucose is a sugar. Anything that ends in OSE, you can think sugar. And so as a sugar, it's a part or a monomer of a carbohydrate. And if you remember earlier from the year, carbohydrates are one of your major macromolecules, and its a carbohydrate's job is to provide short-term store of energy. So glucose is going to provide you with a short-term store of chemical energy. So exactly what's needed for aerobic cellular respiration then? Well, the aerobic part tells us that you need oxygen. And oxygen actually comes as a molecule called O2. That's 2 oxygen atoms bonded together. That's how it's found in nature. The other thing that's needed is glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6. And as we just learned, glucose is your stored chemical energy. Unfortunately, though, glucose won't just start breaking down. It won't just start crumbling apart into different pieces and releasing all the energy it has to build ATP. You actually need a little bit of energy to start to break glucose apart. It takes a little bit of energy to break a chemical bond. So that energy that's needed to start a reaction, all reactions require some sort of energy to get started. That energy is called activation energy. If you think of activation, that means to start, right? So activation energy is the energy needed to start a reaction. For cellular respiration, it's oddly enough 2 ATPs. So that's kind of ironic because if you think about it, the whole goal of cellular respiration is to make ATP. But you actually have to use 2 to get this process to start breaking glucose. But what we'll see is it actually pans out in the long run because you're going to make way more than 2 ATP, so you'll get a big, nice yield at the end. And so once the glucose starts breaking down, that process is actually called glycolysis. We're not going to go in super depth with that, but glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. It gets broken into 2 3-carbon molecules, so it gets snapped right in half. Those molecules are called pyruvate. And that pyruvate then will go on and make more energy. So as that pyruvate then goes through the rest of cellular respiration, it's going to end up making a couple of different products. The first product that's made is carbon dioxide, CO2. The second product that's made is water. And then the third product is your most important product, the one we've been talking about, that all-important cellular energy, ATP. All right, and so what you end up making, this carbon dioxide and water, how you can remember those is if you think about it, think about what we as humans breathe out. We're breathing out mostly carbon dioxide, and if you're breathing on like a window or on a mirror or on your phone or something, you know how it gets like that fog and it's kind of almost gross. You can see like the water droplets. That's water vapor. So you can think of cellular respiration as you're breathing out the waste products of it whenever you're breathing. So carbon dioxide and water are the waste products. The main product, though, ATP, is what we were trying to make. And so exactly what you're going to see here, you need glucose and oxygen. You need a little bit of ATP as your activation energy to break those down, and what you end up with is carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, water, which is a waste product, and ATP energy. Well, you use one glucose molecule. For every one glucose molecule that you use, you need 6 oxygens. You make 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, and about 38 ATP. Whoops, didn't have my marker on there. So that number actually varies a ton. Its maximal yields 38, so we just kind of pick that number because it's easy to go with. But if you think about it, if you make 38 ATP and you spent 2 to get the process started, your net gain of ATP is actually just about 36. And again, that's an approximate number. It changes depending on how well cellular respiration is going or how efficient it's going. There's your chemical formula. So then if you're thinking about anaerobic cellular respiration, it's a way to make ATP, so it's got the same exact goal to make usable cell energy without oxygen. So you're actually still going to use the exact same thing. You're still going to use stored chemical energy, which is glucose. And so you're going to use that stored energy of glucose, and you're going to go to usable energy, aka ATP. The problem is, though, anaerobic, it's not as efficient as aerobic cellular respiration. And if you think about it, that makes sense. We as humans are pretty efficient organisms. We typically undergo aerobic cellular respiration. Anaerobic is only going to make like 2 to 4 as its yield of ATP. So it's making a fraction of the amount of energy that aerobic does. All you need for anaerobic cellular respiration, anaerobic means without oxygen, so all you're going to need is glucose. That glucose is going to end up breaking down into a couple different products. It's always going to make CO2. It's always going to make ATP. And again, I said in the last slide, but it's going to make about 2 to 4 ATP. That's our goal. But then it's also going to make one more waste product. And so sometimes it will make ethanol, and sometimes it will make lactic acid. Ethanol is called alcoholic fermentation if the organism is making ethanol. This is what yeasts do when they're making beer and wine. If you put a bunch of grapes into a vat, you mush them up, you throw some yeast in there. Yeast are living organisms. They don't use oxygen. But what they do use is they use the sugar from the grapes to undergo and make their energy, to make their ATP. So they get glucose from the grapes, make ATP, but one of their products is alcohol, ethanol. That ethanol mixes with the grape flavoring, and eventually you get wine. Other cells, such as our muscle cells, go through lactic acid fermentation. When you're working out all hard, just like I do every day, right? I'm flexing right now, but you can't see it. I'm not kidding. But what happens during anaerobic cellular respiration is that, like, if you're lifting weights or something, that's anaerobic exercise if you're lifting heavy weights. Essentially, your muscle cells just cannot get enough oxygen to make ATP quick enough. So what they need to do is they actually end up going into lactic acid fermentation to try and make some emergency ATP. They're like, oh crap, DePalma's lifting heavy weights here. We got to make some extra ATP. And so they take the glucose and they break it down to try to, in emergency, make some ATP. But one of the byproducts of that is lactic acid. Lactic acid causes your muscles to swell up. That causes you to be a little bit sore the next day. So you may have heard of it if you do sports or something like that. It's the reason why you need to stretch after exercise. But the whole goal of both those processes is a way to make ATP without oxygen. All right? And to summarize what we talked about today, Cellular respiration is the process by which we take stored chemical energy, aka glucose, and make ATP. If it's aerobic, you're using oxygen, so you're going to make more ATP. If it's anaerobic, you're not going to use oxygen, so you'll make a little bit less ATP. I think we've talked about this enough in class that you probably know this, but aerobic cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria, the mighty mitochondria. Anaerobic occurs in the cytoplasm. And that's all for today. Check out my other videos. I got one on photosynthesis. I got one on how photosynthesis and cellular respiration connect. They're all great resources. Use them. Study hard. See you next time.